The Kareth patrol ship entered the Nissa corridor at 2:13 station time without broadcasting approach code, challenge string, or transit notice. One moment the space beyond the outer marker buoys was empty. The next it held a vessel the size of a district block, matte black and sharp-sided, hanging just outside the drift line as if it had always belonged there and the stars had simply been slow to admit it. On Lantern Relay Outpost, nobody saw it arrive. The long-range array had been running blind for 9 days. Senior Systems Tech Amira Vale had filed the first maintenance request when the signal ghosting began. She filed the second when the receiver lag passed from irritating to dangerous. She filed the third with the note partial sensor failure in border corridors/request priority review and got back an automated acknowledgement with no parts allocation attached. At 1940 she filed a fourth request, marked it urgent, then stood in the galley with one hand on the counter and watched the station kettle struggle toward a boil. The galley lights hummed faintly. Someone had left a mug in the sink with a tea bag still drowning in it. In the hydroponics rack near the vent, 2 trays of basil leaned toward the grow strips, small and bright and absurdly alive in a place built mostly from bolts, seals, and recycled air. Amira saved the request, closed the terminal, and went off shift because there was nothing else to do. At 2:14, Commander Halen Drays of the Kareth Expansion Authority stood on his command deck and reviewed the outpost through forward magnification. It was smaller than the briefing image had suggested. 6 pressure modules connected by tubular corridors. 1 comm spine. 1 cargo blister mounted slightly off true, probably from an undocked supply shuttle that had kissed the hull too hard and left someone to promise they would fix it properly next quarter. The station turned slowly against the cloud bands of the gas giant below, its windows lit in warm rectangular rows that made it look less like infrastructure and more like a place where people had gotten used to each other. His adjutant read from the mission brief at his shoulder. Lantern Relay Outpost. Terran Civil Installation under Compact Administration. Primary functions: telemetry, traffic relay, weather observation. Secondary function: long baseline border monitoring. Personnel manifest, 41. Drays kept his eyes on the station. Armament? None. Defensive rating? Negligible, sir. Collision screens only. No military shield envelope. He nodded once. The corridor had been under dispute for 3 years. The Terrans had kept the relay active anyway, claiming civilian necessity and continuity of service. The authority called it unauthorized surveillance dressed in maintenance language. The council had delayed, debated, drafted objections, revised objections, argued over wording, then finally returned an authorization packet stamped in legal blue. Boundary enforcement action approved. Limited objective. Proportional response permitted. He had no reason to feel anything about the station. He had done this kind of work before. Small installations. Peripheral assets. Places that existed just far enough from public attention that reports about them fit neatly into summary lines. He watched one narrow window brighten briefly, then dim again, as if someone inside had crossed a room. "Begin," he said. The first strike was aimed at the communication spine. On Lantern Relay, the warning came not through sensors but through impact. The station jolted once, hard enough to shiver cutlery out of the galley rack. Somewhere deep in the hull a clang rolled through the structure like a hammer striking a pipe. The overhead lights flickered. In her quarters, Amira came awake instantly, all the useless maintenance tickets still arranged behind her eyes. The second impact hit before she reached the door. This one tore the comm spine open. In control, 3 decks forward, the relay board vanished in a sheet of sparks and molten fragments. The duty operator had time to throw one arm over his face before the main wall display died and the room dropped into emergency red. Across the outpost, people jerked awake to alarm tones and pressure sirens and the voice of the station computer trying very hard to sound calm while systems vanished underneath it. Primary communications offline. Primary communications offline. Commander Drays watched the comm spine come apart in 3 clean sections. His weapons officer said, "Signal output terminated." "Power core," Drays replied. The second volley punched through the central bus. Lantern's lights went out in layers, but not many. Whoever had designed the outpost had tied almost everything into one efficient central architecture. There was no theatrical struggle, no long dimming fight. The station lost one bank, then another, then nearly all of itself in under 5 seconds. The warm windows darkened all at once until only emergency strips remained, thin red lines inside a dead shape turning above an unnamed world. On deck 2, Amira hit the corridor wall when the gravity hiccuped and steadied. She was pulling on her boots as she ran, one lace trailing, station shirt half-buttoned, heart pounding hard enough to make thought difficult. Through the narrow port at the end of the corridor she saw something outside she could not understand at first. A black ship hanging in impossible stillness where no ship should have been. The third strike broke lantern at the middle. The central junction split. Corridor seals slammed shut too late. Pressure took one section, then the next. Cargo restraints snapped free in Bay B and sent crates tumbling into vacuum in a glittering spray. The galley ruptured along the outer seam. The kettle Amira had left on the warmer blew sideways through a cloud of glass and boiling water. The basil trays tore loose from their rack and spun once, green leaves bright against the red emergency lights, before the whole compartment peeled open to space. On the Kareth deck, no one spoke above what the work required. Drays watched module after module come apart along their joins. A habitat ring folded. The lower storage blister sheared off and drifted. One final section at the rear, small and cylindrical, held together longer than the rest. Greenhouse, his scanner officer guessed. It turned slowly in the debris field, transparent panels lit from within by backup grow lamps that still glowed white through the dark. For 30 seconds, maybe 40, it was the only illuminated thing left of Lantern Relay Outpost. Then its hull split. The lights vanished. Contact loss confirmed, said the scanner officer. Commander Drays kept watching the debris orbit begin, silent and orderly and irreversible. Far below, the gas giant turned. On Lantern Relay, 41 people had been alive 6 minutes earlier. Now the station existed only as trajectories, scattered heat, and a maintenance request sitting unsent in a local queue that no system would ever read. When he was satisfied there was nothing left to mistake for resistance, Drays said, "Prepare incident record." And in the wreckage, somewhere too small for any gunner to notice yet, an emergency beacon woke up and began to transmit. The beacon activated 11 seconds after Lantern's main power failed. It was a tiny thing compared to the station that had carried it. A sealed cylinder no longer than Amira Vale's forearm, bolted into an emergency recess behind the relay spine with its own independent cell, its own transmitter, and a line of code written by someone who had assumed, correctly, that the worst day would arrive without warning and with enough force to kill everything larger than itself. When the comms spine died, the beacon did exactly what it had been built to do. It began talking. Coordinates first. Then distress classification. Then station identifier. Then repeat. The message went out on the standard coalition emergency band, then shifted half a slice sideways when interference touched it, then shifted again. It did not attempt elegance. It attempted survival. Each cycle lasted just under 4 seconds. Each new frequency hop was chosen from a reserve table specifically designed to complicate active jamming. Somewhere in Lantern's design history, some careful engineer had imagined a scenario in which the station would be too damaged to defend itself, too far from help to expect quick rescue, and too important to vanish cleanly. That engineer had left behind this little stubborn machine. On the Kareth patrol ship, the signal officer caught it on the second loop. "Emergency beacon active," she said. "Independent source. Coalition distress protocol." Commander Drays looked up from the preliminary casualty line his adjutant was drafting. "Jam it." "We are trying." The officer's hands moved across her board in controlled, irritated bursts. Interference patterns bloomed on the tactical display. She caught one frequency, drowned it, and watched the beacon leap elsewhere with almost insulting speed. "It is cycling, sir." "I can see that." "It is not random cycling. The sequence is anticipatory. Every time we close one path, it moves before the lock fully resolves." Drays took 2 steps down to the signal pit and looked at the waveform himself. Persistent. The kind of system only noticed when everything bigger had failed. Can we target it? Not cleanly. It is somewhere in the debris field now, mass below reliable weapons resolution. We can fire into the field, but there is no guarantee of a kill. For a moment he considered it. The debris cloud still spread outward from the destroyed outpost, catching the dim silver of the gas giant's reflected light. Fragment after fragment of lantern relay spun away on its own path. Somewhere inside that widening scatter, the beacon kept speaking into the dark in the same unemotional loop. Coordinates. Distress code. Station identifier. Draze did not like it. Not because it threatened the mission. The South Ass would be back across the corridor long before any meaningful response could assemble. The nearest relay was too far. The nearest patrol group farther. By the time anyone heard the signal, if anyone heard it, the debris would be cold and the incident filed and the legal language already moving through the proper channels. He disliked it because it suggested forethought. Someone had cared enough to build the outpost for this exact possibility. Not just meteor strike or systems collapse or a reactor hiccup. Hostile action. A clean cut to the throat and something still whispering after the body died. The signal officer adjusted her board again. We can suppress reception within local range. We cannot stop transmission entirely. That was almost worse. The beacon would keep calling, and the universe would decide whether anyone was close enough, awake enough, or human enough to answer. Draze straightened. How long does its cell last? Depends on model. With this power profile? 8 hours minimum. Possibly 12. His adjutant, standing just behind him, asked quietly, "Do you want that in the incident record, sir?" Draze looked once more at the drifting field where Lantern Outpost had been. The debris moved with terrible calm. A bent corridor ring turned end over end. The fractured shell of a cargo blister flashed once in reflected light, then vanished into shadow. Smaller objects spun too quickly to identify. Somewhere in that slow mechanical graveyard, the beacon continued its little act of refusal. "No," he said. The adjutant made no comment. He simply removed the line before writing it. At 2:31, the Kareth vessel adjusted heading for home transit. Behind it, the debris field widened. Below it, the unnamed gas giant kept turning through storms older than any border claim in the corridor. And at the center of the wreckage, too insignificant to stop and too persistent to ignore, Lantern's emergency beacon continued to do the work it had been given. It did not know the outpost was gone. It did not know 41 people were already beyond rescue. It did not know that the ship which had killed them was leaving. It only knew that systems had failed, communication had been severed, and somebody, somewhere, needed to hear what happened here. So it kept sending the truth. Into vacuum. Into silence. Into the long dark distance between one human-built thing and the next. 9 light hours away, on Relay Station Halcyon Gate, Night Shift Monitor Jonah Mercer was halfway through the kind of hour that made people question every life choice that had led them into infrastructure. The station's main operations well was mostly dark except for console glow and the soft movement of indicator traffic across 3 suspended panes. Cargo transits were light. Weather packet delays were normal. 2 civilian freighters had filed overlapping routing complaints about a customs buoy in Corridor 8, and Jonah had already drafted the same response twice in slightly different language because bureaucracy liked to feel personally addressed. He was 28, awake entirely on stubbornness and vending machine coffee, and trying not to think about how many more hours stood between him and sunrise. His left screen held the normal sweep output for emergency traffic. Most of it was junk. Old pings, automatic test chirps, a damaged tugboat beacon in a distant mining lane that had been transmitting the same partial distress loop for 3 weeks because nobody could get the owner to authorize scrapping the wreck properly. The system sorted all of it by urgency, distance, and confidence. Usually Jonah skimmed, acknowledged, forwarded where appropriate, and moved on. At 4:52 station time, one line turned red. He saw it. Then saw it again. Then sat up hard enough to bump his knee on the underside of the console. For a moment he simply stared. Not because he didn't know what to do. Because he knew exactly enough about Lantern to understand what he was looking at. 6 months earlier, Jonah had coordinated a routing correction for them after a supply barge missed its transfer window and dumped half their maintenance cargo at the wrong depot. It had taken 4 days, 14 messages, 2 irritated quartermasters, and 1 extremely polite systems technician named Amira Vale who had ended every third note with some version of "I realize this is not your fault, but the array is still dying out here." He remembered that line because it had made him laugh in the middle of a miserable shift. He remembered something else too. The basil. She had attached a photo once by mistake while forwarding a schematic. A tray of basil in the station galley, grow lights too bright, someone's hand in frame holding a mug with chipped enamel around the rim. Amira had sent a correction 30 seconds later. Wrong attachment. Though for the record the basil is the only thing on this station currently thriving. Jonah had replied. Noted for maintenance report. Recommend placing Basil in charge of systems. She wrote back, Basil has declined leadership role but appreciates your confidence. That had been the entire joke. He had no idea why that was what came back to him now. The distress loop continued to unspool on screen. Coordinates. Code. Identifier. Repeating with almost mechanical desperation. He checked the transmission timestamp. Then checked it again. The first burst had gone out more than 9 hours earlier. He did the calculation automatically and hated the answer before the system finished drawing it. No relay lag. No local hold. No queue delay worth naming. Just distance and the indifferent speed of light. Whatever had happened to Lantern had happened long enough ago that anyone still alive there would have spent hours waiting for help that physically could not arrive in time. Jonah stopped that thought before it finished forming. Thinking was not useful yet. Action was. He snapped the alert to primary, opened the emergency chain, and forwarded the packet to station command under standard distress procedure. That took 3 seconds. Then he started doing the things the procedure did not explicitly tell him to do. Military Relay Node. Border Traffic Authority. Coalition Emergency Desk. Signal Preservation Archive. Then one more destination he had never actually used outside training simulations. Incident Review Intake for Hostile Action Verification. His finger hovered for half a heartbeat over the send field. Then he hit it too. The system accepted the packet and sent it climbing outward. Jonah pulled the raw signal into waveform view. The beacon was clever. Frequency hopping on predictive interference logic. Low power, high persistence loop. Whoever built Lantern had not assumed rescue would be fast. They had assumed only that truth needed to stay alive longer than the station did. That detail sat cold in his chest. An acknowledgement came back from Military Relay in under 8 minutes. Too fast. A second from the Signal Preservation Archive in 6. Then the third one arrived, plain text appended to an otherwise automated receipt. Timestamp integrity confirmed. Full transmission chain preserved. Maintain logs. Do not alter source file. Jonah read the line once. Then again. Maintain logs. Do not alter source file. That was not rescue language. That was record language. The sort of language used when somebody, somewhere, already suspected this was going to matter later in a way that required every second to survive scrutiny. He leaned back in his chair and became aware of the room around him again. Ventilation humming. Coffee cooling untouched beside his right hand. The long transparent panel beyond the operations pit showing a slice of black space freckled with cold stars that did not move enough for human eyes to notice. Everything on Halcyon Gate remained exactly as it had been 10 minutes earlier. Air recycled. Lights held. Routing disputes waited in queue. And 9 light hours away, Lantern Relay Outpost had been gone all night. Jonah opened the personnel stub attached to the station identifier. 41 names. He did not read all of them. Not yet. He saw Amira Vale halfway down the list and stopped. He could picture the mistaken Basil photo more clearly than her official file image. That felt wrong in a way he could not explain. A door hissed open behind him. His shift supervisor, still fastening the collar of her uniform jacket, crossed the operations floor at a fast walk. "Mercer," she said, "tell me that alert is a false positive." Jonah looked up at her. The beacon pulsed again on his screen. Coordinates. Distress code. Lantern Relay Outpost. He swallowed once and heard, in memory, a woman he had never met in person joking about Basil refusing leadership responsibility on a dying station at the edge of mapped space. Then he said, very evenly, because he did not trust himself with anything else, "No, I think somebody killed Lantern." Undersecretary Miravos was woken at 6:11 Earth Meridian by a knock that came only in two circumstances: system failure at scale, or the kind of human decision that had not yet been made and would soon need to be. She was 56, gray-haired, and had spent most of the last 3 decades in Terran Compact external affairs learning the difference between a tragedy, an insult, and a test. The first required witness. The second required memory. The third required an answer shaped carefully enough that it could survive history. Her aide handed her a tablet in the half-light of her apartment doorway. Mira read standing up. The packet was clean. Too clean. Distress beacon archive. Timestamp chain intact. Station identifier confirmed. Preliminary trajectory analysis from the military relay. Notes from Halcyon Gate. 41 personnel listed as present at Lantern Relay Outpost at the time of transmission loss. She read the first page. Then the second. Then went back to the first and read the timing again. 9 hours between first transmission and first receipt. The outpost had not gone silent. The outpost had called for help exactly as long as physics required before the call reached somebody who could hear it. That detail did something permanent to the room. Her aide, Tomas, waited without speaking. He had worked with her long enough to know that silence around bad news was not hesitation. It was sorting. Mira did not waste words in the first minute after impact. She put facts in order first. Emotion could arrive whenever it liked. Work would not wait for it. "What do we have from Fleet?" she asked. Border relay says probable hostile strike. Weapon signatures consistent with Kareth patrol doctrine, though they've not formally attached attribution yet. Tomas hesitated. The Signal Preservation Archive added a legal continuity note. "I saw." That meant others had seen it too. The machine had not only stored the beacon. It had recognized what kind of future the beacon might be entering. Mira set the tablet down on the hallway console and walked back into her bedroom. She dressed in the same efficient sequence she had used for negotiations, evacuations, sanctions votes, treaty collapses, and one lunar quarantine event that had aged everyone involved by a decade. Shirt, jacket, hairpin back. No jewelry except the old steel band she always wore. Tomas spoke from the doorway while she moved. "Command wants you at the coordination session in 90 minutes. Coalition Desk has already asked whether we intend emergency filing or private consultation." "Neither," she said. "Yet." She slid a data stick into her pocket, took the tablet back, and read the personnel roster for the first time. No, not yet. There were 41 names. Most meant nothing to her in the personal sense, which was always the first cruelty of these lists. People could be dead before they entered your mind as people. They arrived as entries, strings of letters attached to job codes, ages, housing assignments, emergency contacts. It was one of the oldest ways institutions protected themselves from feeling the full force of what they administered. Mira refused the protection. She sat at the small writing table by the apartment window and opened the lower drawer. Inside was a stack of actual paper. Cheap, cream-colored, unnetworked, impossible to ping, impossible to redact from a distance, impossible to accidentally share with a dozen people who had not earned the right to see it. She used paper only for things she wanted to exist once, in one place, under her hand. Tomas said nothing as she uncapped a pen. She wrote the first name slowly, then the second, then the third. She did not abbreviate, did not compress ranks, did not remove middle initials to save space. 41 people had been reduced once already, first to a station designation, then to a casualty estimate somewhere inside somebody else's targeting summary. She would not reduce them again. Jonah Mercer's notation from Halcyon Gate had been appended near the bottom of the packet. An operator's informal memory. Systems Tech Veil previously coordinated parts requests for sensor array failure. Recalled by name. Beneath that, because someone at Halcyon had added it rather than let it vanish. Earlier exchange included joke about Basil in galley hydroponics. Mira paused with the pen in her fingers. Amira Vale. She wrote it down. The room was very quiet except for pen against paper and the faint city hum outside the sealed apartment glass. Earth morning had not fully broken yet. Somewhere below, traffic nets were waking, kitchen lights were coming on, somebody was making tea, somebody was swearing at a transit delay, somebody was running late to a job whose urgency they would consider significant until they learned what real urgency looked like later in the day. Mira finished the list. 41 names, 11 minutes of writing. When she was done, she set the pen aside and read the page once from top to bottom. Not because she doubted the spelling. Because she wanted the transition to happen properly in her own mind. They were no longer a casualty figure. They were not lantern personnel. They were not station losses. They were people who had worked a relay at the edge of a disputed corridor. People who had repaired arrays, kept weather logs, balanced supply codes, grown basil under artificial light, joked in message threads, and trusted that being a civilian installation still meant something in the galaxy. She folded the sheet once, then again, and slid it into the inner pocket of her jacket. Close to the body. Tomas watched that and understood enough not to ask why paper mattered. What do you need prepared? He asked. Mira stood. Everything, she said. Then, after a moment, but quietly. He nodded once. The first messages from the coalition would be condolences. Carefully phrased, procedurally sincere, morally bloodless. The Kareth Authority would issue its own language soon enough. Border enforcement. Disputed jurisdiction. Monitoring concern. Limited action. Proportionality. She had worked around enough governments to know the shape of their first lie before they told it. That could wait. The names could not. As she reached the door, Tomas said, the preliminary report still lists the 41 as projected fatalities. Mira put one hand briefly over the folded paper in her jacket. Then the preliminary report is wrong, she said. He frowned slightly. We don't have bodies. No, Mira replied. We have names. And with that, the event changed shape. It was no longer just something that had happened at the far edge of mapped space. It was now entered into human memory in the only form that ever made consequences inevitable. The emergency session of the Coalition Border Chamber opened at 1400 hours Nexus Standard in a room designed by architects who believed geometry could persuade species to behave like equals. 200 seats in a shallow arc, same sight lines. Same desk depth. Same translation rigs and water dispensers and recessed lighting chosen to offend nobody's eyes too badly. The chamber always looked calm before a session began. Calm in the artificial, curated way of a place built to contain disagreement without ever admitting how much violence usually stood outside the door waiting to inherit failure. Ambassador Kel Varen of the Kareth Expansion Authority arrived 7 minutes early. This was not normal. Kareth diplomatic culture prized precision in arrival the way some species prized wit or ceremony. Early suggested nerves. Late suggested weakness. Exactly on time suggested control. Kel Varen had built a careful career out of appearing controlled in rooms where other people needed things from him. Today he stood at his desk with a prepared brief open on the surface and did not once look toward the chamber doors. His legal team had given him an excellent document. It was layered, cited, and mercilessly orderly. Territorial dispute in the Nissa corridor. Long-standing compact provocation through unauthorized monitoring infrastructure. Prior diplomatic notices. Proportional enforcement action under recognized border management principles. Regrettable loss of life, yes, but not unexpected in the removal of an installation operating in an active dispute zone after repeated warning. He had read the argument 11 times. It had improved on every reading. That, he told himself, was because it was good law. Across the arc of the chamber, delegations filtered to their seats in quiet clusters of color and posture and species-specific signals. Translation halos warmed. Chair heights adjusted. Water dispensers were used. The ordinary sounds of interstellar order prepared to examine a small atrocity and decide what vocabulary would let civilization continue pretending it had not failed. The Terran Compact delegation arrived 2 minutes before opening. There were 4 of them. One junior attaché carrying a sealed case. one legal advisor with a portfolio tucked under one arm, one military liaison whose expression gave away nothing at all, and Undersecretary Mira Voss. Calverin had seen her only once in person before at a sanctions review 3 years earlier, and remembered disliking the experience for reasons he had never been able to formalize. She did not perform diplomacy the way ambitious people usually did. No flourishes. No dramatic sighs. No weaponized warmth. She gave the impression that she had already finished the emotional part privately and now expected everyone else to keep up with the consequences. She sat, put nothing on the desk, folded her hands, and looked at the center floor as if the next hour did not require her attention at all. That unsettled him more than anger would have. The chair opened the record. Quorum confirmation. Incident designation. Emergency filing acknowledged. Session parameters established. Then the matter itself. Destruction of Lantern Relay Outpost in the Nissa Corridor, civilian installation, personnel loss count 41, attribution under review but preliminary evidence indicating Kareth action. Standard procedure required the named party to speak first. Calverin stood. He was, to his credit, very good at this. He did not rush, did not overreach. He built the case in steady sections, giving the chamber something respectable to hold while the dead remained unnamed in the background. The relay outpost's monitoring function constituted strategic pressure inside a disputed corridor. The authority had transmitted objections through formal and back-channel mechanisms over a period of years. Coalition precedent, particularly the Hadron censure ruling and the Tovi's border seizure matter, established that limited unilateral action in unresolved territorial environments, while disfavored, did not automatically rise to sanctionable aggression when tied to documented warning history and low-scale force application. Low-scale? He used the phrase once. Then again. By the second time, 3 delegates had stopped taking notes. He concluded after 21 minutes with a polished acknowledgement of loss and a formal expression of regret that circumstances had required enforcement action before diplomacy could complete its work. Then he sat down and finally looked at the Terran desk. Mira Voss had not moved during his entire statement. The chair turned toward her. Undersecretary Voss, the floor is yours. She stood, reached into the inside pocket of her jacket, and took out a folded sheet of paper. Calverin felt something cold pass through him, though he could not have said why. The paper itself was ordinary, cream-colored, creased twice. The sort of thing no serious diplomat used when every document in every chamber was version-controlled, archived, mirrored, and indexed before the speaker ever touched it. Mira did not unfold it immediately. She set it on the desk in front of her, rested 2 fingers on it for a moment, then looked up at the chamber. The Terran Compact acknowledges the message of condolence transmitted by the Kareth Expansion Authority through diplomatic channels yesterday, she said. Her voice was level and almost painfully clear. We have entered that message into the record. The pause. It is there. Nothing in her tone rose or sharpened, but the chamber changed anyway. Calverin felt it first as absence. The subtle thinning of the legal air. As if his excellent brief had not been answered so much as moved aside by something operating on a different set of assumptions. Mira continued. The Terran Compact requests a closed mediation session with the senior conflict panel before this chamber adjourns today. That was all. No denunciation. No plea. No demand for sanctions. No recital of outrage. She sat down. Around the chamber, nearly 200 delegates remained motionless in the way intelligent beings do when they understand suddenly that they are no longer attending the most important part of the event. Calverin stared at her. The paper remained folded on the desk beside her hand. The chamber chair, after a delay barely long enough to remain procedural, approved the request. Main session recessed. The side chamber sealed 23 minutes later. Calverin was not part of the closed panel. He waited in the outer corridor with his attaches and watched the door as if sight alone could penetrate confidentiality protocols. Delegates passed by in low murmuring knots, each one trying to look as though this was a recess like any other. It was not. Something had shifted too cleanly for that. After 39 minutes, Mira Voss emerged. She did not look left or right. The folded paper was gone back into her jacket. Her junior attaché carried the sealed case now unlatched, though Kelveren could not see its contents. The military liaison was already speaking softly into an earpiece. Mira walked past him without acknowledgement. Behind her came the mediation panel. 7 senior delegates. All of them sober. None of them willing to meet his eyes. He stepped toward the panel chair, a man he knew well enough to expect small professional courtesies under strain. "Counselor," Kelveren said, keeping his voice measured, "may I ask the nature of the compact's closed submission?" The chair looked at him with an expression that did not belong in diplomatic architecture. Not hostility. Not pity. Something closer to recognition arriving too late. "The content of the private session is sealed under mediation protection," he said. "Then at least the general character?" "No." The answer was immediate. The chair moved on. Kelveren remained in the corridor long after he should have returned to chamber protocol. One of his attaches, very young and still not skilled enough to hide fear from her posture, said quietly, "Ambassador, should we be concerned?" He thought about the 4 words. "It is there." Thought about the folded paper. Thought about the absolute lack of public performance from a government that had just lost 41 civilians at the edge of disputed space and had chosen not to spend its first response on outrage. "Yes," he said at last. "Mark all outbound transmissions priority." Across the station, in rooms not listed on the public session docket, military routing authorities began receiving sealed authorizations. Budget locks opened. Transit corridors changed status. And in the inner pocket of Mira Voss's jacket, 41 names moved with her as the compact left the chamber without having raised its voice once. In the Strategic Assessment Directorate of the Kareth Expansion Authority, analyst Trin Ilias received the first compact budget notice 31 hours after the coalition session and understood immediately that something was wrong. Not because of what it said. Because of how little it said. The notice appeared in the compact's public intergovernmental disclosures feed under the kind of title bureaucracies used when they wanted important things to pass through ordinary channels wearing dull clothes. Strategic reserve reallocation in response to recent border security incidents. Supplemental details to follow through appropriate oversight frameworks. That was all. No emergency address. No parliamentary spectacle. No public demand for justice. No retaliatory rhetoric suitable for consumption by frightened populations or eager commentators. Just funding. Flat language. Administrative tone. A paragraph designed, with obvious intent, to be overlooked by anyone who did not understand what money meant when governments started moving it quickly. Trin read it twice. Then opened the historical index for Terran defense appropriations. She was 39, 17 years into directorate work, and had the kind of mind institutions alternately depended on and found exhausting. Her evaluations described her as methodical, pattern-oriented, insufficiently political in the handling of unwelcome conclusions. She had once been praised by a superior as exceptionally reliable in matters where reality fails to cooperate with preference. The same superior had, 6 months later, advised her to work on her sense of proportion. She did not think proportion was the issue here. She cross-referenced the reserve category against known compact spending classes and felt the first chill before the system finished returning results. Strategic reserve. Not emergency repair. Not border reinforcement. Not patrol surge. Strategic reserve was almost never touched publicly, and when it was, it correlated less with local incidents than with theater-level posture changes. Large movements. Infrastructure deployments. Capabilities not intended for quick reversible signaling. Trin filed her first note to Section Command within 90 minutes. It was brief. Careful. Entirely supportable. Public reserve reallocation timeline is inconsistent with standard compact diplomatic tempo following low-scale border incidents. Recommend elevated monitoring posture pending additional indicators. Her supervisor responded 53 minutes later. Noted. Current consensus, domestic reassurance posture. Maintain ordinary watch. Domestic reassurance posture. Trin read the phrase and disliked it immediately. It had the sound of an answer chosen in advance of evidence. So she kept reading. Public shipping. transit declarations, fuel draws, station departure summaries, auxiliary construction contracts, coalition freight exemptions, procurement anomalies too small to matter individually and too aligned to be ignored together. By the third day she had a pattern. By the fifth she had a problem. Compact military departures from Sol Anchor were rising, but not chaotically. Not like panic. The increase was smooth, disciplined, and distributed across classes that did not belong together in routine response packages. Fleet tenders, deep logistics hulls, long-range escorts, fabrication support, mobile command elements. None of them announced, all of them visible if one knew how to read what governments accidentally revealed when they trusted procedure more than curiosity. Trin knew how to read it. She filed a second report. This one longer. More pointed. Observed traffic suggests not immediate border retaliation but preparation for sustained operational posture beyond proportional demonstrative response. Recommend direct inquiry through back channels while meaningful ambiguity remains. The reply took longer this time. 4 hours. Analysis appreciated. Existing assessment unchanged. Compact behavior remains within posturing envelope following civilian loss events. Avoid speculative escalation language. Civilian loss events. Not lantern. Not 41 dead. Not the relay. Just a category. Trin closed the response window and opened a private file for herself. She was not supposed to do that. Not exactly. Directorate culture preferred that analysis exist inside approved channels where it could be weighted, moderated, and absorbed into consensus until it no longer frightened anyone important. Private files were for people who suspected they might someday need to prove that reality had, in fact, knocked first. She titled it simply, Nissa/Compact. Then she went looking for something deeper than logistics. If the compact was moving this fast without public fury, then the motor driving it was not outrage. Outrage made speeches. This was something colder. Institutional. Pre-decided in some layer beneath politics. So she started reading human history. The Kareth archive on Terrans was large, but like many large archives it had mostly been consulted lazily. Military conflict summaries. Trade integration notes. Cultural etiquette primers. 1,000 pages of useful shallow water. Trin went deeper. Internal wars. Tribunals. Memory laws. Post-conflict doctrine. The moral architecture humans built after surviving themselves. She read late. Then through the night. Then through the next. The more she read, the less sleep felt structurally relevant. What disturbed her was not that humans had a violent history. Every species with cities had one, given enough time. What disturbed her was the recurrence of a specific response pattern. Again and again, after episodes of mass killing, extermination, engineered famine, ideological purges, and state violence that human records preserved with almost pathological thoroughness, the aftermath produced not just mourning but principle. Naming. Recording. Trial. Public memory. And beneath all of it, across centuries and languages and institutions, one repeated commitment. Never again. She ran the phrase through the directorate's semantic matrix and received 6 variations. No second occurrence. This must end here. Not one more time. No repetition permitted. The line is drawn now. Such a thing is not allowed another life. All 6 were correct. None of them were sufficient. Because the phrase did not function as slogan in the documents that mattered. It functioned as permission structure. A civilizational answer to a prior failure. It meant, we know what happens when atrocity is absorbed as tolerable, contextualized into acceptability, filed as unfortunate, and left to become precedent. Trin sat with that for a long time. Then she reopened the lantern file. 41 people at a relay in a disputed corridor. Low-scale incident, if one thought in the language of operations. Potential trigger event, if one thought in the language of human memory. Her third report was the one that got her noticed for the wrong reasons. She attached reserve movements, departure spikes, transit support correlations, and a doctrinal appendix drawn from human historical material. She cited her sources carefully, because care was the only defense analysts ever really had. At the end, she revised the response probability matrix. Open conflict risk should be adjusted from current 9% to no less than 58%, with upward movement likely pending confirmation of deep logistics activation. Human response profile may be governed less by coalition proportionality norms than by internal anti-precedent doctrine rooted in atrocity memory frameworks. The answer came from a deputy director she had never corresponded with directly before. It was only 4 lines. Historical parallels are academically interesting but operationally overstated. Modern compact behavior remains bounded by coalition diplomatic structure. Revise your matrix to align with current consensus. Final note on this interpretation path. Turin read the phrase twice. Final note. Not wrong. Not disproven. Simply closed. She saved the message into her private file. Then she returned to the departure logs. Because consensus, she had learned over 17 years, was often just the name institutions gave to the last comfortable mistake before impact. The first hard proof arrived in pieces so ordinary that, taken separately, each one looked like nothing. A construction waiver on Sol Anchor granting accelerated departure clearance to 3 heavy hulls classified under civilian infrastructure support. A fuel requisition spike routed through strategic reserve channels instead of fleet operations. 2 fabrication tenders reassigned from colony development to special corridor deployment under internal compact code. Then, on the 7th day after the coalition session, the departure logs produced a vessel class Trin Ilias had never seen before. Arc class/infrastructure support platform. She read the line once. Then pulled every open source reference the Directorate possessed on Terran strategic construction hardware and found almost nothing. A fragmented procurement record from 19 years earlier. A mention in a declassified logistics brief about rapid settlement support following climate displacements. An engineering note in a coalition shipyard journal describing unusually large civilian superstructure tolerance loads in a compact hull program whose dimensions had been partially redacted. The dimension that remained was enough. Trin checked the unit conversion twice. Then a third time. 12 kilometers. She sat back from her terminal and stared at the number as if the machine might be embarrassed and retract it. It did not. She opened the construction note again and read it slower. Arc-class vessels were not described as warships. That was almost the most disturbing part. Their published purpose was colony anchoring, orbital fabrication support, atmospheric stabilization assistance, and mass habitat deployment. Civilian megastructure carriers. Planetary-scale logistical instruments. The kind of thing a species built when it expected to remake environments instead of merely travel through them. But the same mass that let a ship build worlds could also let it end them in very specific ways. 3 Arc-class vessels had departed Sol Anchor under strategic reserve authority. 2 days later, for more. Then another 5. The pattern was no longer arguable. This was not symbolic force. Not punitive rating posture. Not border theater intended for negotiation leverage. The compact was moving pieces designed for consequences too large to explain in a press conference. Trin began watching the departure registry in real time. The public summary feed updated every 6 hours as required under coalition transparency law. It was not generous with details. Hull class, departure time, destination band, authority category. Bureaucratic crumbs. Usually enough to satisfy oversight, not enough to tell a story. But stories could still be built from crumbs if you knew what hunger looked like. Military departures from Sol had averaged between 14 and 18 a day for 3 months before Lantern. By the end of the first week after the session, the number was 23. In the second week, 31. By the third, 41. Trin noticed that number and held still for several seconds, unwilling to assign meaning to coincidence and unable not to feel the shape of it anyway. 41. The same number as Lantern's dead. She told herself it was accident. Then opened the destination codes and stopped breathing for half a beat. Most were routine enough. Border patrol redistribution, escort rotation, logistics grid support. But interspersed among them now was an internal Terran designation that did not appear in any public coalition registry. Strategic Reserve/Corridor Black. Trin found a buried reference to the code in an old compact transport manual attached as a footnote to an interagency logistics harmonization proposal no one in the Kareth Directorate had likely read to the end. The note described Corridor Black as a classified operational routing authority activated only under charter provisions relating to non-repeatable security conditions. Non-repeatable? She copied the phrase into her private file. Then she searched Terran legal history again and found the answer where, by now, she had begun to expect all the worst answers to live, in internal doctrine, not public language. Non-repeatable conditions were incidents the Compact had determined could not be allowed to establish precedent through repetition. The phrase appeared rarely and always near the same family of concepts. Civilian targeting. Declarative extermination language. Unanswered mass harm. Attacks intended to test whether a threshold really existed. Trin looked back at Lantern. A weak civilian relay station. 41 personnel. Border corridor. No defenses. Destroyed cleanly. Filed away by Kareth Command as a low-value enforcement success. Her hands hovered above the console for several seconds before she began writing. The fourth report went beyond caution. It named what she now believed. Observed compact movement pattern is inconsistent with pressure signaling and increasingly consistent with pre-execution staging for decisive force projection. ARC class deployment under Strategic Reserve Authority indicates operational scope beyond punitive strike or negotiation leverage. Recommend immediate emergency contact with Compact through protected channels. Recommend civilian contingency planning for Kareth core populations pending clarification. Revised probability of Level 5 escalation, 81%. She sent it not to her direct supervisor but to the deputy director himself. That was irregular enough to carry career risk. She did it anyway. The response arrived 8 hours later while station night rotated over the directorate complex and most of the office towers outside her window had gone dark. Your concern is noted. Current review concludes that available data remains compatible with compact overpreparation for domestic reassurance and coalition-facing deterrence. ARC class estimates are unconfirmed. Maintain standard monitoring posture. Align future outputs with established consensus. This office considers escalation analysis closed unless supported by direct hostile movement. Trin read the message once. Then saved it into the private file with the others. Closed unless supported by direct hostile movement. She turned back to the live departure feed. 3 new lines had appeared while she was reading. 2 long-range escorts. 1 logistics hull. All under Strategic Reserve Authority. No speeches had come from Earth. No grand denunciations. No public threats. The Compact's official communications office had released only 2 statements in as many weeks. One acknowledged receipt of the Kareth condolence message. The other noted that Terran border security infrastructure was under review in light of recent events. Both statements were so flat they might as well have been intentionally anesthetized. That more than anger frightened her. Anger made noise because it needed witnesses. This did not. This was movement without theater. Weight being shifted in the dark by a civilization that had already decided the argument and no longer required applause while preparing the answer. Trin opened a second private document. Not analysis this time. A list. Her mother on Varith Prime. Her younger brother and his children in the coastal district. A cousin in orbital customs. 2 old friends from training school still stationed within the primary defense grid. She looked at the names for a long while. Then opened the personnel leave system and submitted an emergency family travel request. She had not taken extended leave in nearly 2 years. The form approved automatically within seconds. Departure in 3 days. Her mother answered the message almost immediately. Come if you can. I'll make the festival stew even if it isn't festival week. Are you bringing anyone? Trin stared at the screen until the letters blurred slightly. No guess, she wrote back. Just me. When she closed the terminal, the departure feed updated again. For more vessels. Strategic Reserve. Corridor Black. She imagined Sol anchor far across the interstellar dark, traffic lanes alive with quiet departures, crews following sealed orders, Enormous ships leaving dock without speeches because speeches were for moments still open to persuasion. This one, she thought, was no longer open. Not really. The response had already become visible. It was there in the numbers. In the silence. In the size of the ships. In the terrible discipline of how little Earth felt the need to explain. The first alert on Varith Prime entered the defense grid at 3:17 local time and was so far outside expected parameters that the duty sensor officer checked his own board for hardware fault before he reported it. Unknown contacts. Multiple. Transit emergence at the edge of inner system watch range. No filed approach declaration. No challenge response. Mass estimates unstable. He opened the incident manual he had not touched in over a year and read the category twice before calling his watch commander. By then the system had already promoted the contact set to strategic concern. By the time the watch commander reached the pit, 3 more stations had confirmed independent readings and the uncertainty had narrowed just enough to become worse. There were not 3 ships. Not 5. There were 17. They hung at the far edge of Varith Prime's defensive envelope in a loose, impossible line, as if some patient intelligence had placed them there with a ruler and then stepped back to see whether anyone on the planet understood what they were looking at. The duty room filled fast. Shift command. Grid control. Orbital traffic authority. Civilian corridor monitors pulled from sleep with coats half-fastened and voices still thick with the private softness people wore before history entered the room. At 3:41, Commander Halen Drays arrived in the Defense Command Center still pulling on his gloves. He had been home for 18 days. Long enough to resume the habits of peacetime without believing in them. Long enough to read half a book he had not been enjoying. Long enough to stop hearing Lantern's beacon in memory every time station equipment chirped. He had filed the operation. Received formal commendation wording from Border Affairs. Answered 2 follow-up questions from Legal Review and 1 from Strategic Planning. The matter, institutionally speaking, had been finished. Now he stood beneath the tactical dome of Varith Prime Command and looked up at 17 white points at the edge of his home system. Status, he said. The sensor chief did not turn from her board. Contacts emerged from faster-than-light transition 44 minutes ago. No inbound velocity beyond emergence correction. They have held station since arrival. No weapons signatures visible. No response to hail on any standard channel. Identification. Terran origin by drive trace. The pause. Hull class unknown. How unknown? The sensor chief swallowed once. Sir, we don't have a class with these dimensions. The mass estimation algorithm refined again. The number changed. Then changed upward. Then stabilized long enough for the room to feel it. The sensor chief said, with visible effort, current best estimate is 12 kilometers per vessel. No one spoke for 3 full seconds. Drays looked at the display, then looked again as though his training might provide a second reading from the same facts if he stared hard enough. 12 kilometers per vessel. 17 of them arranged in silence beyond the defense grid like a statement somebody had translated into geometry. He had read dozens of Terran capability briefs in his career. Regional power. Significant fleet depth. Industrial resilience. Large but doctrinally bounded escalation profile inside coalition norms. No briefing had included this. On the lower ring of the command center, defense crews began doing exactly what doctrine required when something incomprehensible appeared near a homeworld. Orbital platforms came online in sequence, their firing architecture climbing from standby to active lock readiness. Patrol squadrons broke station and accelerated into intercept bands. Autonomous drone nets woke in waves and unfolded across 3 orbital layers, turning the space around Varith Prime into a dense lattice of decision trees and kill zones. It would have looked reassuring on any other morning. 12 platforms. 400 intercept drones. 60 fast response warships. A defense grid built over 40 years by planners who had assumed the future would remain legible. The 17 ships did not move. That was the part Drays could not place inside any combat rhythm he knew. Ships about to attack usually betrayed themselves in small ways. Orientation adjustments. Targeting handshakes. Shield shaping. Formation tension. The human vessels offered none of it. They sat beyond effective first strike range in patient stillness, neither advancing nor posturing nor making any effort to force the next moment. The patrol fleet transmitted challenge codes. No answer. Coalition emergency channels opened automatically. No answer. Civilian frequencies, standard diplomatic bands, direct command-to-command hail. Nothing. Not jamming. Not refusal with words. Simply nothing, which was somehow more destabilizing than active threat. The sort of silence that did not ask to be interpreted because it was not interested in persuasion. An aide approached Drays with a fresh feed from Nexus Station. Coalition mediation channels are active. Ambassador Calverin is requesting emergency intervention. Good, Drays said, though the words sounded thin in the room. Keep the channel open. He kept watching the 17 points of light. The memory of Lantern arrived the way unresolved pain returns. Not all at once, but through one detail sharp enough to pull the rest of it behind it. Not the destroyed relay. Not even the hydroponics bay. The beacon. That little machine cycling through frequencies in the dark because someone had cared enough to imagine the worst thing and build for it. He understood now, standing under the dome of his planet's command center, what he had failed to understand then. It had never been just an engineering choice. It had been a declaration about the people who built it. They expected loss. They expected systems to fail. And they still expected the truth to survive long enough to matter. At 7 o'clock System Standard, one transmission arrived. It did not come through the direct hails the defense grid had been sending. It came as an open multiband broadcast on every frequency Varith Prime monitored. Military, diplomatic, civilian, coalition emergency, encrypted intergovernmental channels, freight advisory lanes, orbital customs nets, even public relay streams usually reserved for weather and navigation updates. The voice was human. Unhurried. Undersecretary Mira Voss. The Terran Compact invokes the Lantern Protocol under Article 9 of the Compact Defense Charter, she said. Actions currently in motion fall within Terran jurisdiction and are consistent with obligations under Compact internal law. Coalition intervention is neither requested nor appropriate. This transmission serves as formal notice of intent, as required. Then silence again. That was the whole message. No accusation. No demand. No time limit. No terms. Formal notice of intent. Filed the way one filed a lawful transfer or a port authorization or a procedural correction to a system that had already made up its mind. In the command center, nobody moved for several seconds after the message ended. One of the junior officers whispered, too softly to matter and still loud enough that the room heard it, "Intent to do what?" No one answered. Because the broadcast had done something more damaging than a threat. It had confirmed that the Terrans were not here to negotiate the shape of their anger. They were here under a doctrine already activated by 41 deaths, acting inside a legal and moral framework the Varith command structure did not understand well enough and had not taken seriously soon enough. Drays opened a direct command channel himself. He spoke for 11 minutes. He was careful. More careful than he had been at Lantern, more careful than he had ever been in a live military exchange. He invoked coalition precedent, offered arbitration review, proposed full withdrawal to pre-incident patrol lines, offered immediate admission of authority responsibility pending formal hearing language, suggested humanitarian corridor arrangements, independent review panels, temporary military de-escalation zones, direct communication with the High Council. He gave them every clean exit a disciplined mind could produce under pressure. The channel remained open. He heard the connection, heard the faint system hiss of an active line reaching something on the other end vast enough to swallow whole fleets. No one replied. "They are receiving?" he asked without turning. The communications chief checked twice. "Confirmed, sir. Active receipt on their end." Active receipt. Deliberate silence. Drays sat down in his command chair because his knees had started to feel untrustworthy and he would not give the room the spectacle of seeing that happen. He looked up at the tactical display where his world glowed at the center of its layered defenses, and beyond those defenses 17 ships held position with the composure of objects that did not need to hurry. This, he thought, was the confrontation. Not battle. Not yet. This waiting. This unbearable pause in which one side still believed words might restore the future and the other side had already moved beyond the part of history where words were relevant. Above Varith Prime, the defense fleet held. Beyond it, the Terran ships did not advance. And between them hung the worst kind of silence, not empty, not uncertain, but final enough to make everyone who heard it understand that some decisions arrive long before the first shot. The first Karath platform died at 7:19. No warning flare preceded it. No final demand. The platform simply vanished from the tactical grid in a brief white bloom so bright the display dampers took half a second to compensate. By the time the room's eyes caught up, the weapons officers were already shouting over one another, trying to identify what had hit it and from where. They never produced a useful answer. The strike had not come from the patrol fleet. Not from a missile spread. Not from any vector the defense grid had been trained to privilege. One of the 17 Arc-class vessels had rotated by less than a degree. Somewhere along its impossible length, a system no public Terran document had ever admitted to possessing had spoken once. The result was a hole through Platform 3 so absolute that the platform did not break apart right away. It ceased to be structurally meaningful first, then came apart in pieces too small for the old identity to matter. Return fire, somebody said. But the order had no clean target attached to it. Not really. The Arc-class line was still 17 points at the edge of the system, still patient, still almost offensively composed. The Karath defense grid responded anyway because doctrine required response and because training survives several seconds longer than comprehension. Planetary cannons lit. Drone swarms launched. Patrol squadrons accelerated. On the tactical display, Varith Prime's military machine unfolded in full. Commander Halen Drays watched it happen with the distant, desperate clarity of a man who still knew the shapes of correct behavior even while beginning to suspect correctness no longer had much leverage here. The defense grid had been built to repel fleets of known proportion. Fast warships. Heavy cruisers. Strike carriers. Numbers that fit on older pages of military theory. It had not been built for 17 12-kilometer facts. The second Terran strike did not hit the warships massing in intercept bands. It hit the fire control lattice that linked 6 orbital platforms into a coherent system. Half the grid went blind in the same instant. Not destroyed. Worse. Intact but unable to speak to itself. A whisper of static crossed the command center as autonomous systems attempted handshake recovery and failed. 2 patrol commanders began issuing contradictory movement corrections. Interceptor drones, severed from centralized prioritization, defaulted into overlapping local threat logic and wasted precious seconds negotiating each other's airspace. The Terrans were not attacking like raiders. They were editing. Removing war from the places it knew how to stand. Drays felt the understanding of that arrive in him slowly and then all at once. Not because he was stupid. Because there are realizations so foundational that the mind resists them until resistance becomes more exhausting than acceptance. He had thought Lantern was a low-value relay. That was the first mistake. He had thought the question after Lantern would be one of proportionality. That was the second. The real question, the one he had not even known he was answering on behalf of his government when he signed the operation record and let 41 civilians become a number in a tidy report, had been something else entirely. Would this be allowed to become ordinary? The answer was now moving through his home system at weapons range. A patrol wing broke formation on the display, trying to flank the nearest Arc-class vessel along an approach curve that would have been clever against any sane opponent. The human ship did not maneuver to evade. A narrow fan of defensive fire crossed the vacuum once, almost lazily, and the wing came apart in a sequence of 6 clean losses, each so fast the eye registered them as one event. No pursuit followed. No excess damage. The surviving Karath ships were left alive long enough to understand they had been measured and found irrelevant. Drays had spent his whole career respecting efficiency. He had once considered it a moral trait in command. Clean operations. Limited objectives. Minimal unnecessary suffering. At Lantern, he had told himself that efficiency proved discipline. Now he saw its opposite. The Terrans were also being efficient. Terribly so. But their efficiency was not built around acceptable loss calculations and boundary management. It was built around preventing repetition. Every strike selected infrastructure that made Kareth power projection possible while stepping around civilian population centers with such surgical consistency that the pattern itself became impossible not to notice. Orbital platforms, command relays, defense cannons, fuel depots feeding military response, transit control for armed fleet movement. Not cities, not markets, not habitation districts. That choice was not mercy. Not only mercy, it was message. We know the difference, it said. We will not become what you were prepared to call routine, but we will remove from your hands the ability to test this threshold a second time. An aide hurried to Dreza's chair carrying a fresh high-priority line from the High Council. He did not take it immediately. He was looking at the display where 3 Terran vessels had altered spacing for the first time since arrival, not advancing toward the world itself but widening their geometry around it, sealing off military escape vectors with the relaxed certainty of a species that had already done the necessary math. "Commander," the aide said quietly, and there was fear in the title now. "The Council requests your assessment." Drez took the line. The Chancellor's face appeared above the armrest projector, blurred by secure compression and lit from below in the harsh way emergency calls always lit powerful people. "Report," the Chancellor said. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, Halen Drez did not know how to begin with something that sounded like command language. The familiar vocabulary all seemed too small. Tactical disadvantage. Escalation event. Defensive compromise. None of it touched the actual shape of the thing. "We misjudged them," he said at last. The Chancellor's jaw tightened. "That is obvious." "I am asking in what respect?" Drez looked up at the 17 white points holding their line in the dark beyond his world, then at the spiraling wreckage that had once been Platform 3, then at the growing dead spaces in the grid where Kareth doctrine was being carefully, deliberately excised. "In the oldest respect," he said. The Chancellor said nothing. Drez continued, because now that the truth had broken open, leaving pieces of it unsaid felt like cowardice, and he had had enough of small cowardices disguised as professionalism. "We thought they would treat Lantern as an incident. A terrible one, but still an incident. Something to condemn, document, negotiate around. We thought 41 civilians at a relay station in a disputed corridor was a number that could be folded into process." On the display, one of the planetary cannons disappeared in a silent lance of Terran fire. The Chancellor closed his eyes briefly. Drez went on. "That was the error beneath all the others. Not tactical. Moral. We counted them before we understood them. We filed the dead before we understood what the filing meant to the people reading the file." He could hear his own pulse now. Not fear of death. Something stranger. The sensation of history reclassifying him while he was still inside it. "They have not come here because Lantern was strategically important," he said. "They have come here because we attempted to teach them that some of their dead could be made administratively tolerable. They are answering the lesson." The line stayed silent long enough that he thought, for a moment, the Chancellor had cut it. "Then, what do you recommend?" Drez looked again at the tactical map. At the 17 ships. At the damaged but untouched civilian bands across Varith Prime. At the discipline of a force that had every capacity to turn punishment into annihilation and had instead chosen something colder, narrower, and in its way more devastating. He thought of Amira Vale, though he had never known her name when it mattered. Of the beacon. Of the report line that had read 41 Terran personnel killed and nothing else. Of how easy that had felt to sign. "Surrender military authority in the corridor," he said. "Immediate admission of unlawful action. Full access to all records. Open responsibility, not mitigation. And pray they came for correction, not for symmetry." The Chancellor did not answer. Somewhere behind Drez, communications officers were still trying hails no one intended to return. Somewhere below the command center, civilians were waking across Varith Prime and checking local feeds and realizing, in fragments, that the sky had changed. Drez ended the call before he was formally dismissed. which in any ordinary hour would have been unthinkable insubordination. No one remarked on it. Another Arc-class vessel shifted by a degree and a half. Another defense node vanished. And in the deep cold place where all his careful justifications had lived for weeks, Commander Halandres finally understood the full shape of what he had done. He had not destroyed a relay station. He had offered 41 human lives to history as a test case. The humans had returned his answer in the only language left. 6 weeks later, the Coalition border chamber was full before the record opened. Not formally full. The attendance slate still showed the usual sequence of confirmations, substitutions, remote links, delegation notes. But the room had the particular density that came when too many governments had realized, at roughly the same time, that they had just witnessed the end of one set of assumptions and had not yet agreed on the language for the next. The Verith delegation was present. Smaller than before. Ambassador Calverin had resigned 12 days after the strikes on Verith Prime's defense grid, citing personal accountability in a moment requiring other forms of service. Nobody in the chamber believed that phrase had originated with him. The seat now belonged to acting envoy Sarah Dane, a cautious woman with a good legal record and the face of someone who had inherited a fire after the roof had already gone. The Terran Compact delegation arrived exactly on time. Same 4 people. Same arrangement. Same stillness. Undersecretary Mira Voss sat down, placed nothing on the desk, and folded her hands. If anyone in the chamber had expected triumph from her after the Compact's demonstration at Verith Prime, they were disappointed immediately. She did not look victorious. She looked like a person carrying a burden that had proved necessary and remained a burden anyway. The session chair opened the record. Formalities. Quorum. Matter before the chamber. Review of the Lantern Relay Outpost attack, compact action taken under Article 9, and coalition findings regarding unlawful force against civilian infrastructure in disputed space. Then he looked to the Terran desk. Undersecretary Voss, he said, you have the floor. Mira stood, reached into the inside pocket of her jacket, and withdrew the folded page. This time, everyone in the room understood what it meant before she unfolded it. Even the delegates who had not been present at the first session had heard enough to recognize ritual when it entered a chamber wearing the same plain shape twice. Mira laid the page flat on the desk and looked up. I would like, she said, to enter into the permanent coalition record the names of the personnel present at Lantern Relay Outpost at the time of the Kareth strike. No one interrupted. No one objected. She began to read. Slowly. Not ceremonially, exactly. That would have made the act feel staged, and Mira Voss had no interest in turning the dead into theater. She read them the way facts should be read when they have already cost enough. Each name clearly. Each rank intact where rank existed. Each civilian designation left plain where rank did not. Amir Vale. Jonah Mercer, listening from Halcyon Gate over the station-wide civic feed with his unfinished shift report open and untouched on the desk, felt the room around him disappear for a moment when he heard the name. Not because it surprised him. Because the sound of it made something settle that had been moving restlessly inside him since the beacon arrived. Names were weight. Names made evasion expensive. Mira continued. 41 names. 41 complete sentences. 41 lives restored, publicly and deliberately, from summary language back into personhood. When she finished, she folded the page once, then again, and returned it to her jacket. The Terran Compact has no celebratory statement to make regarding the actions taken after Lantern, she said. The chamber remained very still. She went on. We do, however, have an explanation. That was new enough to make several delegates sit forward. Myra's voice did not change. The Compact acted because our history instructed us to recognize a specific danger when it appears in administrative form. Not only mass harm. Not only civilian death. The greater danger that follows it. The argument that some categories of people, in some locations under some legal framing, may be killed and then entered into process as tolerable. Acting Envoy Sarah Dane of Verith lowered her eyes. Mira did not look at her. For 3 centuries, she said, human law has carried a principle shaped by our own failures with one another. The details differ by era, by court, by charter, by language. The core does not. Certain acts cannot be permitted to harden into precedent. Certain dead cannot be converted into policy whether. She paused. At Lantern, 41 civilians at a relay station were killed and filed as a manageable border event. The compact determined that if we accepted that framing even once, we would participate in building the next one. No one in the chamber moved. A delegate from the Moravian League asked the question everyone had prepared in softer wording and failed to soften in time. So the destruction of the Verith defense grid was intended as deterrent doctrine? Mira looked at him. It was intended, she said, as correction. The word passed through the room like a current. Not vengeance. Not retaliation. Correction. A legal concept. A moral concept. A terrifyingly disciplined one. The Moravian delegate tried again. Many in this chamber would argue that what the compact did risks making force outside coalition mediation more normal, not less. Yes, Mira said. That risk was assessed. No decoration. No apology tucked inside it. Just assessment. And yet, she continued, we judged the greater risk to be the normalization of civilian erasure under territorial language. There is no relay remote enough, no casualty number small enough, and no procedural gloss polished enough to make such a thing ordinary to us. At the far end of the arc, a very old delegate from the Karen houses closed her eyes briefly in what might have been grief or assent. The questioning continued for almost 2 hours. Coalition charter boundaries. Jurisdiction under Article 9. Why the compact had targeted military architecture while avoiding major civilian centers. Whether Verith Prime itself had been in direct danger. Whether the silence before first engagement had been intended to produce political pressure. Mira answered each question in the same even voice. No dramatics. No raised volume. No indulgence. On the question of civilian avoidance, she said, precision was policy. On the question of why no public ultimatum was issued before the strikes on Verith infrastructure, she said, a warning had already been given to our own people and ignored. We chose not to repeat the form of that mistake. On the question of regret, she stood still for a moment long enough that even translation systems seemed to wait differently. The Terran compact regrets Lantern, she said. Completely. Nothing more. No one asked her to expand. Later, in a smaller side room, Terran Ilias gave formal testimony to the mediation panel. She brought the private file on a physical storage wafer and the print copies of the 4 reports she had filed before leaving Verith space. She described the reserve movements, the ARC-class departures, the phrase non-repeatable conditions, the deputy director's response, the closure of analysis under consensus language, and the exact point at which she stopped trying to persuade her chain of command and started trying to get home before the answer arrived. One of the panel members asked whether she believed the result could have been avoided. Trin considered the question with the exhaustion of someone who had asked it privately too many times. Yes, she said. At several points. By peace. No, she said honestly. Not necessarily. But by something smaller than this. That answer went into the sealed record too. The coalition spent the next month producing resolutions in the language coalitions always preferred. Findings, censures, binding restrictions, review mechanisms, corridor oversight structures, civilian protection amendments, emergency beacon preservation requirements, and a new evidentiary standard for disputed zone attacks that several delegations quietly began calling the Lantern threshold before the paperwork had even been translated. The compact accepted some of it, ignored some of it, and said almost nothing more in public. That was perhaps the hardest thing for the rest of the galaxy to understand. The humans had acted with devastating scale, then declined to narrate themselves into grandeur. No victory parades. No speeches about strength. No mythology performed for applause. Only the names, the record, the doctrine, and then work. On Halcyon Gate, Jonah Mercer stayed late 3 nights in a row after the session closed. The maintenance wing on Deck 6 had an abandoned hydroponics alcove behind environmental control that no one used because the light strips hummed too loudly and the drain line needed occasional hand flushing. Jonah requisitioned a tray, a grow pad, nutrient mix, and 1 small packet of basil seeds through a system form labeled Personal Morale Horticulture / Low Priority Consumables. The quartermaster approved it without comment. Jonah set the tray himself, packed the growth medium carefully, laid the seeds with more attention than the task technically required, adjusted the grow strip angle twice. On the housing edge, he fixed a handwritten label under clear tape. Lantern. That was all. No flourish. No explanation. The first shoots appeared 6 days later, thin and green and slightly uneven because the old light strip on the left side still ran hotter than it should. Jonah checked them at the beginning of every shift and again before going off duty, though there was no practical need. The station around him remained exactly what stations always were: vent noise, routing disputes, stale coffee, repair tickets, human beings keeping indifferent systems from falling apart. But in the alcove behind environmental control, something from Lantern had found a way to continue, not literally, not by blood or recovered seed or miracle salvage, but by the much older human method of refusing to let the small living thing be the part that disappeared. One evening, near the end of shift, Jonah stood with a spray bottle in one hand and looked at the little leaves reaching up into artificial light. He remembered the mistaken attachment from Amira Vale. The basil tray in the galley. Her message about it being the only thing on the station currently thriving. He had almost forgotten the exact wording. Now he smiled despite himself. Outside the narrow maintenance port, stars held their places in the dark as if nothing in the galaxy had changed. Inside, on a station that had heard the beacon and preserved the record and forwarded the truth because one tired monitor had refused to trust the usual cue, a tray of basil grew under humming lights. Not as answer. Not as victory. As continuation. And in the chambers and ministries and military archives of half the settled worlds, where governments would spend years arguing about legality and proportionality and the proper limits of doctrine, one fact remained stubbornly alive beneath all interpretation. Lantern Relay Outpost had not vanished into acceptable numbers. The dead had been named. The line had been drawn. And somewhere, because humans were still humans even after all the law and grief and force, somebody kept a living thing watered in the dark.